political rights. What are these political rights? The right to speech, to assembly, religion, privacy, and express. What are some of the other rights? Should we think about it? Now, these are political rights, and each of these political rights is considered sacred. If a country violates, for example, freedom of press, you know the country has violated human rights. If the country silences some of the people who are religious believers, you know it's a major violation of human rights. If the government is not particularly concerned with the privacy, if the government is not particularly concerned about the free flow of information, and the government, any control, any attempt to do anything about these basic values or these basic rights will be criticized as a violator of some basic human rights. And this continues to be the accepted value of all human rights discourse, human rights applicants. The second generation of human rights can be characterized as economic rights. Economic rights, you can say the right to security. Of course, the first generation human rights may accept that as well. But to food, in other words, basic livelihood, people should have the right to live, to have the subsistent level of economic well-being. Clean water, which is argued time and time again now, each and every human being. Clean air is difficult to maintain, but clean water, you know, how many people do not have access to clean water? We're talking about billion. You know, there are only 6 billion people in the world, but approaching, certainly 500 million and so forth, but approaching 1 billion people do not have access to some of the things we take for granted. And of course, shelter. So these are argued, especially in developing countries, as basic human rights. So is it possible for us to trade the two? Well, this is an interesting position. Can we say, let's sacrifice freedom of speech in order to enhance the availability of food for the society, or even employment? Is it possible for us to sacrifice the right to assembly for the purpose of security? Many societies put security or stability as major values, because without stability or security, the government will not survive, the environment will not be congenial to economic development, and then everybody suffers. And in the general discussion in the world, especially dictated by powerful industrialized Western countries, this is totally unacceptable. In other words, you have to have political rights as not simply instrumental values, as intrinsic values. For example, when South Africa practiced apartheid, and all countries would criticize South Africa. And then, of course, South Africa stopped it, and then Mandela emerged as probably the most respected leader in the world. And so that's a change. Any expression, you know, any pretext of the government to say, well, for economic well-being, we need to eliminate, even for the time being, some of these rights, such as freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and so forth. And most of the intellectual community in the world, and of course, global community as a whole, will consider that as an excuse. There was a debate, a very interesting debate, it's no longer the case now, between giant, that's the United States, and Singapore. The population of Singapore is about 500 million. And because the idea that Singaporean society wanted to maintain certain kind of stability. So the electoral process from the American point of view is not totally democratic. And so the society is not democratic. The society is authoritarian. Later they consider this form of authoritarianism is a bit different from other forms of authoritarianism. So they use the term soft authoritarianism. Even with soft authoritarianism, it's not democratic. It is, the reason it's not democratic is because it's exercise authority or using the government using legal means to undermine the freedom of speech, assembly, expression. And of course, the freedom of the press. And right now in the Google case, right, it's absolutely critical for the whole idea of political rights. So even though some societies, I think America has to recognize the importance of economic rights and are trying to accommodate that situation. Homeless, and people no shelter, and even we have people who suffer from starvation, and no access to clean water, even though the percentage of the people as a whole is extremely small, and presumably these problems are solvable. These are important concerns. Even though they are important concerns, they're not going to be used as an excuse to undermine the first generation of political rights. There's a third generation. The third generation refers to cultural rights and the group rights, the question of sovereignty. And the question is raised, is sovereignty right more important than individual right? And sovereignty right is the country's ability to maintain its territorial integrity. And this, of course, is a strong argument. And then you have the cultural rights, because we know in the world today, cultural diversity will have to be generally recognized. And cultural diversity is predicated on different ways of organizing social lives. And some of the customs lasted, continue for not only decades, for centuries. Should these customs be protected? Even though on the surface they are hierarchical, they're non-democratic, they are coercive. And this is rather interesting. It's not an amusing, but interesting situation when India was under the control of England. So there's the Indian practice that when a husband died, the wife will be burned together with the property of the husband, because this notion about renouncement. If the husband died, it should be done. That's custom for years and years and years, for centuries. And so there's argument to the government. This is our practice, and we'll continue to do that. But the response is that you are now under British law. If you kill an innocent person, you'll be executed. And so these are two very, very conflictual. Of course, the British rule won, and right now most Indian scholars believe the British rule actually was more civilized. And now, of course, in India, this is more or less abandoned. There are many, many practices that lasted for centuries but turned out to be very inhumane. And you have to have some standards to deal with this kind of questions. So cultural diversity shouldn't be used to undermine the universality of political rights. So this is very widely accepted. And I visited China shortly after the US bombing of the Chinese embassy in Weiming. And I was asked to give a talk. My talk was on global ethics, nothing to do with human rights. But the first question I was asked, because the previous day